Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is an extra special edition for the incredible mind of our good friend, Edward Ed Smith. And as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. A note from the author. I apologise for my absence, but work has gone crazy. But I would like to thank all listeners that have taken time to listen to, yes, my clinical insanity. Now, this story has a lot of detail, and hopefully you will listen to it several times and let the detail sink in. And I believe you will get the thrill that I did while writing it. My next endeavour is a story I have been kicking around for a while. It's entitled Species X, the incident at Horseshoe Bend, an Illinois scenic riverboat trip nightmare. It's bloody gory and action-packed. Yeah, it's time for one of those, and another Deep Fork episode is in the mix as well. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Hard Landing, Roswell, Ed's version. Let's get straight into that. The following tale is fiction, based on actual events. Possibly, however, the most terrifying is the uptick in certain sightings or encounters after this incident. This may explain the development of the missing 411 cases, and if this is the case, then the terror is closer than any of us ever imagined. The overwhelming vastness of space is populated with star systems, and cradles of life and violent deaths of stars and celestial monoliths of stone, metal, and frozen gases of exotic essence. As the large mothership passes into the outer reaches of the Oort cloud, at a distance from Earth of 100,000 astronomical units, and to put it into perspective, 1 astronomical unit equals 93 million miles. The boomerang-shaped vessel has to slow its approach considerably as it passed through the heliopause, which is the theoretical, for us, but very real boundary for them, when the sun's solar wind is stopped by the interstellar medium. This is the point where the solar wind strength is no longer great enough to push back the stellar winds from the surrounding stars, and depending on the solar weather that day and time, it can spell disaster for the ship as the positive and negative pressures meet. The vessel's speed is further reduced, as not to collide with the large chunks of frozen gas vapor the size of mountains and some remnants of several planets that never completed their birth, or at least were stunted in their growth as we assume it to be, with our current understanding of our solar system. The commander of the vessel has been here several times in our past, once when we were but small mammals scurrying around looking for the occasional grub, and yet another time when the Mesopotamians were having conferences with the Anunnaki, and then again when the French were screaming Via la Revolution. Other Vartas ships such as the Exploration-class vessel have visited at other times in our remote history and ran into some unsavourable beings. And well, when they started shooting at each other, the Indus Valley took the brunt of the devastation, as the melted bricks of the Mohenjo-Daro can testify to. The violent and awe-inspiring display of unbelievable unearthly powers of destruction that was unleashed upon our world was biblical, to say the least. Mohenjo-Daro translates to the Mound of the Dead Men. Mohenjo-Daro was not the original name of this city. The original name may be lost to that violent, antediluvian age, but it very well could be the site of the lost city of Mersh, where Vimanus, the mystical flying machines of the Indus Valley of this age, were said to have been stored or constructed there. The commander of the Vartas vessel ordered several scout/extraction-class craft to be readied for release to check on and reconnoitre pre-selected areas of our solar system. As the crews of the half-moon-shaped scout craft begin to work up their units, which will become to be known as the MJ-class 4703, the mothership settles into an orbit of the planetoid just inside the Kuiper belt. That was named the 9th planet in our own solar system. Pluto, on February 19, 1930, by astronomer Clyde Tombath of the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. The craft crews were stowing equipment and supplies for 9 evolution periods. This is their unit of time and calendar keeping. One evolution period is 71.6 terrestrial Earth hours, and the craft has 22 live specimen containments, but no examination compartments are on board. All examinations and dissections are done on the mothership or on advanced science barges, which are shaped like cylinders with tapered ends and are over 800 feet in length and 140 feet in diameter, which were designated MJ Class 7107. These are carried on the external surface of the mothership's hull, as it cannot fit in the landing bay of the mothership, and each mothership does carry a total of 4 such barges, with full crews for each. The flight control clears the scout extraction craft for departure, and the large doors of one of the 6 craft bays slowly open. And from them, several craft leave the mothership's belly and begin their courses to their assigned areas, like bees from the hive. As this is happening, one of the advanced science barges separates from the mothership's hull and sets course for the planet known to them as Sol 1106-06, or Jupiter. Now, 1106 is the designation for our Sun. There are 2,218 Sun-type stars in the stellar maps. The asteroid belt is located between the planets Jupiter and Mars. This area is where another planet existed and was known to the Vartis' mothership as Nar-Mon Blue. It was destroyed by the same conflict that laid destruction to the Indus Valley. It was truly a violent time for our world, but from our perspective, it was from our antediluvian period, in which much of humanity was put in peril by some of the vilest creatures known at that time. Jupiter will serve as the waypoint for collections this time around. More to the point, it will be in orbit of Europa, Jupiter's icy moon, with oceans of liquid water under its ice, and is teeming with life, and one large Vartis science base built some 600 feet below the ice, and a 350-foot vertical shaft down to the moon's ocean. The science barge is expected to pick up several dozen live specimens to be returned to the Vartis Regional Biolabs on the 6th moon of Cent 2289-07. The planet Taurus in the Alpha Centauri B system, some 790,000 astronomical units from Earth, or a little less from Jupiter. 2 of the scout extraction craft were dispatched to Earth, and as they take up their patrol routes looking for specimens, one of the craft receives a call to inspect a specimen for the 39th time. The craft reroutes to Sector 385 as the craft streaks in from the west and slows down to about 400 miles an hour. It quickly passes over the town of Stroud, Oklahoma, and then arcs its direction south over the small town of Melfay, Oklahoma, when it slows drastically to just 50 miles per hour as it begins to descend from 5,000 feet to just 120 feet in the span of 4 seconds, while making virtually no noise, and then settling over a single white trailer just south of the Deep Fork Wildlife Refuge. The craft slows to a stop, and a dim bluish beam begins to scan the trailer, and the crew then descends from the craft to begin their work. It is now 1 a.m. Central Standard Time. The second scout extraction craft was now tracking and closing on a new specimen, one previously unexpected. The ship was invisible to visual observation and appeared as a flock of birds on radar as it entered the airspace over Amarillo, Texas. A second advanced science barge was also dispatched to the Amarillo, Texas location to perform the examination of the new specimen, after extraction by the crew already closing on the subject. The examination team was ready in the chamber for the expected arrival of the new subject. And as the scout extraction craft slowed and began its descent onto the Amarillo Air Force Base, which was deactivated in 1946, the buildings were being renovated for peacetime use and/or destroyed. The craft was zeroing in on one of the construction workers that lived on site in his Airstream travel trailer, one of only 3 travel trailers on the entire base. The time now is 1:14 a.m. Central Standard Time, July 6th, 1947. The second advanced science barge arrived and went on station just southwest of Gage, Oklahoma, and parked just 100 feet above some open farm and pasture land in between Shattuck and Gage, where they waited on a call for the specimen pickup. Flight control was informed of inbound traffic from another scout extraction craft from another mothership that was operating nearby the Wolf 359 system. As per our current understanding, this system has 2 known planets, but the vastest known of 11 planets in this system. 3 are Earth-like, all are primitive, even by Earth standards. At a distance of 7,856 light-years from our Sun, the astronomical units are equal to 495,400,000 AU, just for some perspective, with a declared cargo of 22 sensitive live specimens in total. The crew of the inbound scout extraction craft has requested an immediate transfer to the advanced science barge due to containment equipment issues. Flight control has cleared them to proceed into Earth's atmosphere and meet up with the barge now on station in Oklahoma. And as the scout craft descended into the thick lower atmosphere of the planet over the southern part of Nevada, having cleared the Las Vegas airspace in less than 40 seconds, and as it approached the airspace of Flagstaff, Arizona, the crew observed a large thunderstorm complex over the Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range northwest of Alamogordo Army Airfield in New Mexico. The time is now 2:44 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. The craft continued its descent to the altitude of 46,000 feet, just enough to clear the thunderheads and upper-level turbulence erupting over the Mescalero Indian Reservation, as the sleek, ultra-smooth craft skimmed over the ever-expanding tops of the exploding atmosphere that the pilots of these crafts called Riding the Sparks. The craft was struck by a large vertical discharge of electrical energy known as a sprite. This took the navigational systems offline and prompted the system to reboot. This took only 7 seconds, but during that time, the course of the craft drifted northeast until the altitude changed from 46,000 feet to 18,200 feet. At the same time, the phased ion induction generators failed to compensate for the gravitational field fluctuations, which allowed the speed to fluctuate and create surface turbulence, and with the effects of the thunderstorm winds caused the normally smooth performance of the craft to turn into an earthquake-shaking table. This caused the crew to become more disorientated, and when the craft broke through the cloud deck of the storm complex, the pilots overcompensated and put the craft on course that would take it over Roswell, New Mexico. The time is now 3:18 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. The thunderstorm complex was building in intensity, and the volume of lightning and the sonic booms of the approaching injured scoutcraft were gaining in volume and frequency as they began to rattle Rancho Mac Brazil's ranch house on the Foster Ranch. As the craft pilots began to gain control over the pitch and yaw of the half-moon vehicle, like a meteor out of the western sky, a second scout extraction craft that was operating in the area crossed the flight axis of the injured scout craft, but the pilots had only fractions of a second to make history-making decisions. The left arc of the craft clipped the second craft, and this put the injured scout extraction craft into a flat tail spin at 6,100 miles per hour. Even for a craft of this technological advancement, the aerodynamic shockwaves were too much to compensate for, as the viciousness of the aerodynamics of the craft's instability and system failures manifested into a flight trajectory back to the northwest towards Captain Mountain Range. The time now is 3:29 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, July 6th, 1947. At the second scout craft, now gravely damaged, the crew had barely enough time to realize the tremendous problems that were about to beset them. The phased ion induction generators were knocked offline. They had a magnetic valve seal leak that was allowing Illyrium, also known as Element 115, to escape containment, with power now failing all over the ship. The phasing instability of the neutron injectors were allowing unmonitored amounts of Illyrium to be mixed with radical ions, and the resulting hypercollapse of the ignition chamber allowed for the uncontrolled reactions of Illyrium's nucleus to become ion-saturated. The resulting quantum chain reaction that stripped the electrons from their orbits and the fundamental force of the feed electrons vaporized most of the ship at a subatomic level. But the surviving parts of the craft rained down onto the Foster's ranch in a large debris field. The time now is 3:33 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. The shock wave from the quantum blast was felt at Max Brazel's home and resulted in broken windows and articles being knocked from his kitchen shelves. Even while the storm was raging, the shockwave was utterly unnatural and its thunderous intent. In a 1955 interview, Mac had said the noise just did not sound like any other big storm he had ever heard, and that is why he went looking a couple of days later. While the pilots of the craft hurtling towards the Captain Mountain Range were unable to knoll out of the spin, and as they were about to pull up and gain some altitude, the right arc of the craft struck a boulder outcropping, and this caused the craft to lurch forward, and after striking the ground, it began a cartwheel on its edges some 20 times in the sand of the valley floor. Its speed slowed with every revolution of the half-moon disk. The interior of the ship had not been breached until it impacted with the solid boulders of the face of the mountains. This tore a large hole in the side of the lower half of the disk and allowed one of the crew to crawl outside and pass away as the day broke across the area. The time now is 5:44 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Flight Control received a crash beacon some 10 seconds after the craft came to a rest on its side in the desert area just northwest of Roswell, and the mothership is now sending out a search and rescue craft to the crash location. Flight Control engineers going over the telemetry for the second down craft reported that nothing will be left of any value of the craft, and it should just be listed as destroyed. The commander of the mothership had to order all craft back to the station. As the Zaragadi armed transport ship entered the Oort cloud on the other side of the solar system, and under orders from his regional command, they were not to engage any other race while out on an acquisition mission at this time. The search and rescue craft returned with all the rest of the vessels, except for the 2 scout craft that were lost. The Zagoradai are a warlike race and do not take prisoners after conflict. It's best to stay clear of them. The commander of the Vartas mothership noted in his ship's log that it was extremely unusual for the Zagoradai to show up in the system so unexpectedly. The time now is 6:09 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. The smoke was hanging low to the ground on the valley floor of the crashed scout craft. As the haze of the smoke on the interior of the craft began to clear, the crash sensors were able to shut down the phase neutron injectors and the ion induction generators successfully, thus avoiding a catastrophic quantum implosion. But as the main power was shut down, the energy cells took over and supported the ship's systems, but the drain of energy brought on by the requirements of the craft's pod containment system depleted the energy reserves quickly. They were being shut down by the automated onboard control systems. The pod started a reviving process, and soon all 22 pods were in the revival mode. 1 hour and 18 minutes later, the pod doors were opening, and the pod lights were dimming and flashing out. And the only light that was streaming into the craft's pod bay was coming from a large hole ripped into the ceiling and down one wall of the bay. Sunlight of the early dawn, brought on by sunrise, illuminated the interior of the craft. The time now is 7:39 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. As the sunlight struck the contents of the Pod 9, the specimen label on the door read, Flora Majin, Adult. As a matter of fact, all the pod doors were labeled the same. This specimen was the first to be revived from the containment stasis, and as it leaned forward out of the vertical containment pod, it fell forward onto the floor of the cargo bay. As it struggled to stand, it stretched its long neck, which was some 18 inches long, on which an oblong head and bulbous vertical slit eyes opened. And as it gazed around the room, the other specimens were waking up. The mandibles of its jaws stretched and snapped with an audible click of every motion of its horrifying awakening. And as it stood erect, the shoulders were very much human-like, and the arms were very muscular, and as it found its footing in the bay, it was almost 9 feet tall. Its hands were shaped with 3 phalanges, and one thumb shaped like a hook with several barbs at the end of the arc of the thumb. hung just above the reverse leg joint, much like an earth canine. The legs and feet were exceptionally muscular. The feet had 3 what we would call toes with claws, and the foot was long, some 16 inches and about 4 inches wide at the heel, and 9 to 10 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The webbing in between the toes was thick, but very flexible. The skin was dark grey in colour and was covered with scales, and these scales seemed to move and flex independently as if they had an individual muscular control. Covering the scales was a microscopic crystalline shapes that seemed to refract light, and when the creature moved into the direct sunlight coming through the hole ripped in the hull of the ship, these scales reacted and the shape of the flomoragin disappeared. And then when the entity seemed to readjust the configuration of the scales, the body shape reappeared. As more entities became conscious and ambulatory, it seemed that arguments and squabbles between smaller groups of the 22 creatures in the bay broke out. It was apparent that the group was of a different lineage of affiliations, and several subgroups began to crawl out of the craft and onto the valley floor and into the light of day, where they became acclimated to the yellow light of our star, and as the cloak of the natural camouflage became familiar to them, the subgroups began to move out into the valley floor and dispersed into every direction of the compass in groups of 2 or 3. The time now is 7:59 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Varta's flight control received the craft's manifest as to what kind of cargo was on the Lost Scout, and the commander of the mothership countermanded the order to return to the Vartas regional sector and ordered the mothership to move into the orbit of Sol 1106-07, or Saturn, and match the navigation that would keep the large planet in between the Zagharadai vessel and them. The frail-looking commander, with a large head and almond eyes, sat in his chair and wondered how he was going to explain what he was about to do to his superiors. Then he opened an icon on his display, which was marked Xenomorphic Decontamination Procedures of Remnant Populations and Planetary Systems, and he began to read. The time now is 11:19 p.m. July 6th, 1947, Mountain Standard Time. One of the alien creatures entered the south end of the railway yard in Roswell, New Mexico. With its cloaked camouflage active, it moved within a feet of a group of vagrant and hobos. It reasoned that it was undetected by the group of humans, and while the Flomoragin are not a spacefaring race, they are cunning and a predatory species, and this one was looking for prey. The drugs of the containment that block all desire to feed were now wearing off, and the creature was on the hunt. But they are very mindful that it cannot be out in the open. The hunter needs its privacy to do its predation. The entity, while watching the trains moving in and out of the yard, observes a man in his mid-20s hop into an open boxcar moving east out of the yard. The entity, gliding on its legs with a stride of 8 feet, was at the opening of the boxcar door, and while keeping pace with the ever-increasing speed of the train, reaches for the handle and steps up inside. The prey target is sitting on the floor, and with its back against the forward wall of the rail car, and there was no other occupants. The prey target was smoking a cigarette and had not noticed the disturbance of dust and dirt that the entity created when it jumped up into the rail car. The entity sits still and didn't move for over an hour and a half. It's just watching the prey target and was gathering information about this new offering of sustainment. The entity took one step, then another, and stopped, again observing the prey. And as the entity was in 15 feet of the prey, the man got up and walked within 3 feet of the entity and passed it. And while standing in the door of the moving rail car, he began to urinate out of the door. This startled the entity, and he moved quietly to the side wall of the rail car and stood in the darkness of the freight carrier, bobbing and weaving and tilting his head, still observing the prey target and learning everything about this mannerism and behavior. And the man moved back to his original position and sat down. The entity did not move for another hour and a half. It just sat there quietly watching, listening, smelling, and calculating its moves. The creature took one step and paused for 30 minutes, and then took 2, and then took one more slowly and methodically as it approached the prey. And as the train moved through a road crossing, There were several cars parked waiting for the train, and their headlights lit up the inside of the rail car. This backlit the creature, and for just a second or so, two of the edges of the entity were visible, and it became aware of this almost instantaneously. The creature crouched blindingly fast, and the man did not glimpse it, but the entity was not sure, and it stayed crouched for 2.5 hours. The time is now 3:44 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, July 7th, 1947. The entity stood up slowly and took one step, then two more. Now the creature was within 4 feet of the target prey. It reached out with its left arm and with its hand only 9 inches from the target prey's face. It raised its left hand to expose its 2 glandular ports under its wrist. The outside port opened and it emitted an exceptionally fine mist. It was directed at the man's nose and mouth. He breathed in while smoking another cigarette as the mist entered his sinuses and it travelled very quickly into his bloodstream. He began to convulse and the paralyzing effect of the nerve toxin took hold. The man's arms and legs were paralyzed, as well as his vocal cords, but his breathing functions were not affected, nor his cardiovascular system. The man laid on his right side as the entity slowly decloaked in front of him. The man tried to move away and scream, but was unable to do so. The creature pulled him away from the wall of the rail car, and the man was laying on his back now. With its hands, it tore away the man's clothing, and he was naked within a few seconds. The entity, with its mandibles clicking and snapping, lowered its head over the man's right thigh, and the man was terrified and could not even utter a whine or a whimper. The mandibles seemed to stop moving, and a long, sharp, very bony proboscis extended from its mandible-lined mouth. The proboscis was about 12 inches fully extended, and with one quick and extremely forceful whipping motion of its long neck, punctured the man's thigh and drove the proboscis into his femur, where it began to suck out the bone marrow. This process was repeated to every large bone in the man's body. The pain was blinding, and he could not even move or scream from the violence of the puncturing process and the action of the bone marrow extraction, coupled with the sheer terror of the sight of the entity. It was more than his body and mind could take. At the age of 24, he was in a cardiac arrest. The creature finished its depraved meal, and then it sat back on its bent legs and watched the man struggling to even breathe. The creature retracted its proboscis, still dripping with blood and marrow. It extended both of its hands, and from a glandular port on the inside of its wrist, a course of thick mist of droplets and phosphorescent bluish-green liquid was emitted from the port, and the entity moved its hands back and forth over the man's body, as to ensure an even dispersal of the substance. Once in contact with the man's skin, the nano-enzymes began to eat at the flesh of the man's body. The enzyme film was dissolving the skin, flesh and bone matter of the man. The excruciating and agonizing pain from being dissolved could only be detected in the man's eyes and face, as the paralyzing toxin was wearing off. And within 45 seconds, the man's body was like that of jelly, and after 2 minutes of the grotesque act of the entity, there was nothing left but dust that was being blown around the rail car. The entity curled up in the corner of the boxcar and fell asleep as its eyes closed. The natural reaction of the entity's body cloaked itself, and it disappeared. And the creature did not wake until the train was a couple of hours to the west of Oklahoma City, and as the train neared its destination, it jumped from the train where it found itself, standing alongside the train tracks in the afternoon sun, and observed that there were cornfields to either side of the railroad tracks, where it moved quickly into the stalks of the tall corn. The time now is 2:14 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, July 7th, 1947. William Mac Brazel, a ranch foreman, was inspecting the western limits of the Forster Ranch, looking for any storm damage that may have happened the previous night, and as he crested a small rise in the topography of the ranch's most western pasture, he notices glints of light coming from the ground and a large gouge in the dirt of the pasture. He approaches an area of the sparkles of light and sees debris of something like he has never seen before. There were sheets of metal that were very thin, but when he picked it up, it was so lightweight It was almost like holding air. He tried to bend it, but when he did, it returned to its original shape. He also discovered what looked like some kind of metal beam, with strange markings on the side of the beam. It too was lightweight. There was this kind of debris lying all over the pasture. The debris was scattered over an area that was about 200 feet in width by 800 feet in length. He gathered up several pieces of debris and put it in his truck and tore off towards the town of Roswell. He drove up to the sheriff's office in the town square and went into the office and talked directly to Sheriff George Wilcox, who in turn called the Roswell Army Airfield and spoke to the intelligence officer major, Jesse Marcel. And once the major met with the sheriff and Mac Brazel, he returned to the base and assembled a detail to visit the Foster Ranch. The time is now 4:22 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, July 7th, 1947. The Roswell Army Airfield's public information officer, Walter Holt, issued a press release stating that personnel from the field's 509th Operations Group had recovered a flying disc, which had landed on a ranch near Roswell. And as the press release raced over the news wires, a Herculean effort to gather the last of the fragments of the craft were being loaded at the crash site for transport back to the lonely hangar 84 at the southwest end of the main runway. When the man in charge of the recovery effort, Colonel Elijah Tate, was about to release the site from federal control back to Mac Brazel, as the radio from one of the scout planes that was tasked to give a lookout over the area of 50 miles for anything unusual. The radio traffic began sparking over the speakers in the colonel's jeep, and the jeep driver called out to the colonel that he'd better hear this traffic for himself. The time is now 6:12 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, July 8th, 1947. The colonel's jeep rolled up onto the site of something that Colonel Tate could barely comprehend. The forward guard had already cordoned off the area, but what he saw through the windshield of his jeep was utterly amazing. Colonel Tate observed that there was a craft that had a general circular shape, but it had a large slice cut or ripped into its form and was lying on its side, almost at a 90-degree angle. And there was more debris located around the craft that looked like the first crash site. However, what truly shocked him was that there was a body of some kind of being or creature laying on the dirt of the valley floor at the bottom of a large boulder wall that was part of the Captain Mountain Range. He approached the body, and the sergeant in charge of the site walked up and began to brief the colonel on what was known so far, and that there were 5 bodies recovered and 1 was alive at least for now. The colonel, with a look of surprise and shock, instructed the sergeant to call in for more men and expand the security perimeter and take him to the being that was still alive. Now they had the being in a bed of a deuce-and-a-half truck and was trying to give some medical aid, and he could see that the being had light injuries, mainly scrapes, cuts and scratches. When Colonel Tate attempted to communicate by speaking to the being, it indicated that it needed something to write with. A pen and paper was brought to it, and they wrote some strange symbols, and underneath each symbol was a letter from the English alphabet. The message read, "Must find specimens. Your planet is in danger. Must find specimens. Waste no time. Danger. Don't trust your visual senses. Must find. Must terminate. Extinction level infestation." And then the being passed out. Colonel Tate stood there with a note in his hands and paused for about 5 minutes, and then began issuing orders, and the site became a beehive of activity. Bulldozers and road graders were brought in so as to improve the dirt trail, to allow large flatbed trucks and semi-trailer trucks to access the site, and a crane from the engineering detachment was brought to the site as well. Big lights were installed so the operation could continue to work through the night. The airspace for 200 miles was locked down, and the armed aircraft were put on patrol to offer close air support and airspace security. The bodies were crated and packed in dry ice for the trip back to Roswell Airfield. The craft was loaded onto the flatbed semi-trailer and was triple tarped so that none of its features could be described or seen while under observation. The area was canvassed, and all debris was picked up, and nothing was left of the craft or of the passengers. The decision was made to travel back to Roswell Army Airfield at night, which would provide cover for the large movement of military vehicles. The convoy moved out, and the bulldozers and road graders went to work on destroying the road they built for the recovery operation. The time is now 6:19 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, July 8th, 1947. The mothership had dispatched a reconnaissance craft to locate and find the crash site and recover the bodies of any survivors. The recon craft had been on station since the military vehicles rolled up to the second crash site, and they were ready to go in and recover the crew and destroy the craft in place, capture and study the military personnel on site. However, the decision was made not to attempt this due to the fact that the Segregati vessel would pick up on the disturbance and would come in with every intention of capturing them and the Earth personnel along with all cargo. In a word, it would be a disaster. The reconnaissance craft was ordered to observe and report only. The convoy rolled onto the airfield property with the crash craft, all debris and the bodies. The convoy pulled into a large open doors of the Hangar 84 and began unloading. And when they arrived, the hangar was in total lockdown and several field grade officers were swirling around the area. Brigadier General Langley from Fort Worth, Army Airfield in Texas, he had ordered the entire airfield locked down as per the nuclear strike protocol. He had arrived several hours ago and wanted Colonel Tate's briefing as soon as he stepped out of his jeep. Colonel Tate's response was, "Here is all we know," as he handed the General the note that the being had written, and he responded to the General that we're still working the problem. After reading the note, the General Langley walked over to the side of the hangar where multiple tables were set up with signs above them. He stepped up to the one with a sign marked Operations, picked up a phone and began to read the note into the phone. He turned and looked at the floor and then looked at Colonel Tate with an unbelievable fear in his eyes. The time is now 3:10 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, July 9th, 1947. The Gunnison National Forest was established on June 13th, 1905, and covers 1.67 million acres in the counties Mesa, Gunnison, Hinsdale, and Saguache in the western part of the state of Colorado. There are over 100,000 acres of private land within its boundaries, and with two peaks over 14,000 and 13,000 feet in elevation, the terrain of the park has Mother Nature's watchful eye. The Taylor Lake is located within the park in a peaceful and serene saddle between two of the foothills of the larger peaks. The lake is surrounded by a gentle glaze of short grasses where the wildlife grazes on a daily basis in the more temperate seasons. The glades spread over from the shores of the lake up to the pine and the aspen tree lines. The distance from the shoreline to the trees is 800 to 1100 feet, allowing bush and backcountry campers to view the wildlife grazing right from the opening of the tents. Jake Sellers, Kathy Bennett and Cam Anderson were friends from college, and they developed a similar liking of camping very early in their freshman year. The guys entered college within a month of their discharge from the Navy, and now they are juniors, and the next fall they will begin the push towards the last year of college studies. But this day, it's all about the moment. The late afternoon passes with pleasant conversation, and the backcountry supper was excellent as the afternoon turned to evening, and they were consciously aware that they were the only campers in the vicinity of the lake. The evening turned to a lazy, quiet night, and the three friends settled in for the evening. The moon rose and bathed the lake, and they glowed in a brilliant moonlight, and the stars were crisp and clear. At about 1:30 a.m., the opening of the four-man tent slowly started to unzip. A few inches, and then it stopped, and then a few more. Then the opening was completely unzipped. The flaps of the tent were gently moving with the breeze of the night, when Cam felt the cool breeze on his face. He woke from his sleep and noticed in a haze of his sleepy vision that the door flap was open. He figured that one of his friends had to relieve themselves. But when he looked over at the other sleeping bags, they were present, and he knew the door was closed when they went to sleep, because he closed it. Cam crawled to the door opening and put his head through and looked around. The campfire had died down to an incredibly low flame, and everything looked normal. He pulled his head back into the tent and scooted back to his sleeping position. When Jake woke up and asked what was going on, Cam told him about the door, and the conversation between the two caused Kathy to wake up too. Then it was determined that none of them had opened the tent door, and this caused Jake to pull his hunting knife from his pack and slide it under his pillow. And the moonlight was bouncing off a Cam's side of the tent, and so the need for flashlights wasn't really required. The three settled back down and had a drink of water and shared a snack bar. When the door flapped of the tent opened slowly, all three sat in place frozen in fear. The terror amplified itself when they could see no shape in the doorway, just the fire pit and the low flames. But you could see where something had a hold of both door flaps, with the fabric of the tent in its grasp, and they could hear whatever it was breathing. Jake sat up and slid his right hand under his pillow and grabbed his knife. Cam grabbed the flashlight and turned it on the bright setting. The light exploded in the tent, and the tent flaps shuttered as the creature shrunk back from the bright beam. Kathy screamed and threw her heavy, hiking boot at the void, squatting in the doorway of the tent, striking it in the chest. As this disturbed and distracted the creature, its scales shuffled. For a few seconds, it became visible in the beam of the flashlight. As all three of the hikers pushed away from the opening of the tent in absolute horror and shock, the creature turned its head towards Cam, as it flexed its long neck and snapped its mandibles, and its broad shoulders flexed as if it was preparing to pounce on Cam, when Kathy, who had an air horn that she kept for bears, grabbed it and pointed it at the creature and squeezed the trigger. The sound was deafening, and the creature let go of the tent flaps and stumbled back, and as the flaps were closing, it recloaked itself and disappeared. Terror and frightening waves of doom swept over Jake, and he slashed the back wall of the tent, opening up a makeshift doorway, and ran out of the tent. Dressed in his t-shirt and boxer underwear and socks, he was followed by Kathy, and not too far behind was Cam, who kept looking back with his flashlight. Jake was almost to the tree line when he stopped and turned, and was happy to see that Cam and Kathy were running in the moonlight. Even though they were about 150 yards away towards a trail off to his left, he could see them running. When he began to run parallel to the tree line towards them, he realized he was about 100 feet from the tree line. When he tripped, and with a rolling fall, he hit the ground with a thud. He regained his footing and was in the process of standing up, when he realized the creature was standing about 20 feet from him, standing on two legs that were bent backwards like his dog's, and it had a torso like a man, and broad shoulders with muscular arms, and a long neck that rose up to support a mantis-shaped head, a short snout with a mandible-filled mouth. It took one step towards him, and that's when he felt like he was at a concert, and a very low hum forcibly hit his body, and he instantly felt nauseous and dizzy. But he had the presence of mind to start running, and he made for the tree line. The creature began to pursue him, and was voracious in its intent. Cam and Kathy did not stop when they hit the tree line. Their feet were taking a beating, but adrenaline and terror filled their minds. They were running down a game trail when they took a turn to the right, when he was grabbed by an invisible force that slammed him up against the tree. Kathy was following so close that she ran into the creature, and as she stumbled backwards 4 or 5 steps from Cam, she saw the creature decloak, and it was angry and furious at her. It flexed its long neck and hissed and snapped its mandibles and shot its proboscis out at her. Cam screamed, "Run, Kathy!" and she paused, and then the creature turned its attention back to Cam, and while holding him by his throat with its right hand, it raised its left hand and emitted a fine mist that covered his face. And as he started to convulse, he gasped, "Run, Kathy, run!" And she did as she ran for her life, as the undergrowth tore at her clothing and flesh as she escaped. The creature picked Cam up and threw him about 30 feet onto the forest floor, and it was on him instantly. The paralyzing toxin had not taken complete effect as the creature punctured his humerus and his right arm, and began the aspiration of bone marrow fluid and injection of digestive enzymes in order to break down solids, and reaspiration of the marrow slurry. He screamed from the pain of the creature's stabbing force, as his screams turned to murmurs and then silence. Kathy's terror-filled run through the forest was a long and frightening experience, with every bush, tree and shadow giving her the feeling of being surrounded by the creatures and the beasts of her insane flight from this nightmarish reality. And as dawn broke and the sunlight created some comfort, she fell to the forest floor and crawled up and under some undergrowth bushes, and she fell asleep for a few hours because she was exhausted. When she awoke, it was probably noon, and she continued in the direction that she was running. After about a mile, she came upon a large brown bear carcass that was fresh, but it looked like it had punch marks on its front legs and shoulders, but the lower half of the bear was liquefied. It just seemed so freakishly strange, she began to back away from it when she heard a snap of a twig. She whirled around, and there it was, another creature fully visible, but this one was smaller, maybe 5 feet. It looked at her with curiosity and wonderment. This was too much for her to take. She screamed and started running frantically and without caring, and after about a mile, she ran into the middle of a 2-lane road, where she collapsed, crying hysterically. Unbeknownst to her, she had crossed over the boundary of the national park and was running onto private land. The 3 logging semi-trucks loaded with timber came to a halt, almost screeching their tires. They got out of their trucks and tried to render some aid to her. They loaded her up into the cab of the first truck, and they took her into the nearby town. And none of the men noticed the 2 creatures piggybacking on the timber-filled trailers. The creatures jumped off the trailers in the nearby town of Poncha Springs, Colorado. And as Cam's body had liquefied, it began to disintegrate into dust. As the cat and mouse game continued between Jake and his pursuer, Jake was only maybe 10 seconds ahead of the creature when he ran past and crossed over a small shallow stream and ran up the slope on the far side of the stream, towards what he thought was a cave. Once he got to the rock face, he realized it was a rock overhang. There was no time to continue running. The creature was closing in on him. Jake crawled into the rock overhang, and he found that it was only about 22 feet deep into the rock face. But it was the only place that might protect him. He found himself in the back of a dark overhang and could see out down the slope. He could also see the stream he had crossed. Jake lay there as quiet and motionless as he could. He strained his body to control his breathing and intense fear from whatever this thing was. He could only hope that the others got away in another direction. After 15 seconds after he had taken his position in the overhang, he heard a noise coming from the stream area, and, to his horror, all he could see was splashes in the stream, and something was running up the stream bed. And then there were no more splashes, as if the thing had stopped mid-stride and was just standing there in the water. And Jake thought, "Oh God, please don't let it find me." The creature decloaked in the middle of the stream. It was maybe 50 feet from him. He was absolutely paralyzed in fear, and as the creature's head swiveled around on its long neck, it seemed to look right at him. He put his face down on the dirt floor of the overhang, as to not let it see his face. And when he looked back up, about 20 seconds later, he just glimpsed the creature running up the other side of the stream bank, decloaked and away from him. The sense of relief was so great that his body ached from the endorphin release. He waited close to 40 minutes after it ran away, and he was just about to move when, from left to right, he saw footprints being made in the mud just in front of the overhang opening. Footprints without seeing any foot making them. He froze in blinding terror. He swallowed what spit he had in his ever-drying mouth. The footprints stopped in front of the overhang, and then it decloaked, and Jake thought, "Oh God, no, it's going to come in here." He could see from the backwards knee to the foot. Jake gripped his knife and readied himself for a battle of his life when the creature raised its right foot and stepped up onto the rocks above the opening and climbed up onto the top of the overhang. And then he thought, "It either does not know that I'm in here, or it's playing with me and letting me know that it knows." About a minute later, Jack saw more splashes in the stream as another creature decloaked and walked up the slope towards the overhang. "Oh my God, there are 2 of them," Jake thought to himself. He was nearly in tears. The second creature slightly shorter than the first seemed to be looking up at the first one as it was motioning with its arms, and Jake could hear ringing in his ears, and the pitch of the tones were painful and caused a great amount of irritation. He thought, "These damn things are communicating with each other, and they're going to hunt me down." And as Jake was thinking this to himself, the second creature turned and began to walk swiftly down the slope and cross the stream. when the first creature jumped from the top of the overhang and landed on both feet in front of the opening to the overhang, and then followed the second creature across the stream and into the tree line. And for the second time, Jake breathed a sigh of relief. Jake waited about an hour, and nothing, not a sign or sound of anything. He still had good light left, and he slowly made his way to the opening of the overhang, literally inches at a time. He climbed down to the overhang, and everything was normal, and there were forest sounds. He walked over to the trail that went in the opposite direction that the creatures had travelled off in hopes that he would not be crossing their path again. And as he started jogging down the trail, from across the stream in the wall of undergrowth, the bushes parted, and nothing was standing there. Then they closed again, and a few seconds later, there were splashes in the water. Jake Sellers and Cam Anderson were eventually reported missing. Kathy Bennett was admitted to a mental health facility where she was permanently committed. 14 months later, Kathy never changed her story, even though it was too fantastical to believe. 3 years later, her identification status was later updated to MJ-47-1643. She was fitted with a radio anklet device in 1979. She'd somehow kept getting out of her cell and was found walking the fenced-off areas of the facility. No one could explain why her radio anklet signal would disappear and then reappear. The time is now 9:13 a.m. Central Standard Time, July 8th, 1947. As the story of the crashed flying saucer ranged across the planet, the dimensions of the situation were beginning to take hold. President Truman established the National Intelligence Authority on January 22, 1946, by presidential directive. It was the direct predecessor to the CIA. From one of the officers that was serving as the Assistant Director for Operations at the National Intelligence Authority, sent a memo to the Joint Chief of Staff Fleet Admiral William Daniel Leahy. Within hours of the receipt of this memo, Colonel William H. Blanchard, commanding officer of the 509th, contacted General Roger M. Ramey of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas. Ramey ordered the object to be flown to Fort Worth Army Airfield. At the base, Warrant Officer Irvine Newton confirmed Ramey's preliminary opinion, identifying the object as being a weather balloon and its kite, a nickname for a radar reflector used to track the balloons from the ground. And the famous photo was taken shortly thereafter. A telex sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation from Fort Worth, Texas office quoted a major from the 8th Air Force, also based in Fort Worth, at Carswell Air Force Base on July 8, 1947, as saying that the disc is hexagonal in shape and was suspended from a balloon by a cable. However, the control number to this telex was drastically different from the one listed in the Bureau's own registry. The telex in the National Archive appears to have been inserted into the telex registry after the fact. We can only suspect that the telex that was a complete accounting of the survivor wreckage, debris and corpses, with so many parts in motion. It's hard to believe that a weather balloon could cause such a stir. Later, in June of 1951, some of Roswell's former base personnel were interviewed by a journalist from a Dallas newspaper, and they all confirmed that they had recovered debris from a weather balloon before, and so it was inconceivable that someone from the base could make such an error. When contacted by other media outlets for further interviews, the veterans would not speak of it again. All would be deceased within 2 years of the publication of the first interview. When other journalists contacted him about reviewing his notes, he responded by informing them that his notes and recordings were destroyed when his car caught fire 3 days after the story ran in the newspaper. 2 months later, he would pass away of a heart attack. The time is now 11:55 p.m. Central Standard Time, July 10th, 1947. Roy Joseph Turner became a prominent businessman in real estate, oil and gas, cattle ranching, and eventually became the 13th governor of Oklahoma. As governor, Turner helped establish the state of turnpike system and college board of regents. He oversaw the end of segregation in Oklahoma's higher education system, but while he was governor, he maintained control over his real estate businesses. One of those businesses that was in his real estate portfolio was a series of warehouses located in the western district of Oklahoma City. These were brick and stone 3 or 4 story structures, and with sub-basements and full basements as well. One of the buildings was a refrigerated warehouse, one of only a few in the city at the time. These were torn down to make room for the new city post office at Reno Avenue, after many complaints of vagrants and criminal influence in the area. However, in the late 1940s, the area was an industrial manufacturing powerhouse. The Brown and Turner warehouse was utilized as a general goods storage facility. The 4 stories of space and sub-basement storage area made the facility one of the largest in the Oklahoma City region. On this night, 3 security guards, a switchboard operator who also doubled as an order taker, and 2 warehouse staff had just begun the night shift, and there was a backlog of work for the warehouse workers to finish that night. And the security guards began their rounds. They were armed with 38 special revolvers. The floor plans of each story plus the sub-basement were identical and consisted of 55,000 square feet of storage space per floor. The basement was for the boilers and water storage tanks and a host of other support equipment and mechanics. The large freight elevators were massive, and the double winch mechanisms were state-of-the-art for 1940s. Gary Nelson had been working at this job for about a year and 3 months since he was released from the army at the close of the war. He was an infantryman in an armoured unit during operations in Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, as the Allies battled the German expeditionary force known as the Afrika Korps. Rick Dawson was the newest one of the crew. He had only been with the company for 13 weeks and was still learning the ropes. He had been a medical corpsman for the Navy in the last 9 months of the war, before Japan surrendered. And the night shift was in its 5th hour, and they had just come back off their lunch break, and Rick grabbed his platform truck and wooded onto one of the elevators and told Gary he was going up to the 4th floor to pull his next order from the west end of the floor, and he would be back in a few. The freight elevator arrived on the 4th floor, and they pulled the sliding gate up, and it opened up to reveal a mostly dark room. But this wasn't unusual, because the incandescent light bulbs blew out frequently on this floor, due to the installation of the circuit breakers and not bar fuses. And the voltage irregularities were constantly blowing bulbs. The remaining bulbs that were still operational created pools of light up and down the central walkways of the large shelving units on this floor, and could get a little creepy at times. But Rick didn't mind. He knew he was locked in the building. He arrived at the location of the parts and boxes he was to pick up when he felt a breeze that he had never felt before. He walked another 150 feet or so to the western wall of the building and was surprised to see one of the heavy tilt windows with steel mesh embedded in the glass for added strength was open. This was very odd because the rules were none of these were to ever be opened. Rick went to one of the nearby extension phones and asked the switchboard operator to connect him to the security office. Mike Patterson answered, and Rick reported an open window and went back to the fully loaded platform truck as he began to push it towards the freight elevator that he was at least 450 feet away from, when he heard a noise off to his right. It sounded like it came from the 3 shelf rows over, but he could not see anything. Most of the light bulbs had been blown out in the middle of the area, and so it was very dark. He was coming up onto one of the light poles, and then he thought he heard a sound behind him. He turned and saw nothing. When he was about to turn back to push in the hand truck, he was struck from the right rear by a force of incredible strength, and the invisible force pulled him down to the floor. The creature and Rick rolled to 2 or 3 times on the floor, and the creature knocked over the platform truck, spilling the boxes and parts all over the floor. During the struggle, Rick was able to get a hold of the crowbar that he carried on his platform truck to open crates that struck the creature in one of its arms. Rick's fear blossomed as the creature decloaked only inches from his face as the 2 were struggling on the floor. He gasped in fright, and Rick's reaction took the creature by surprise, and that gave him time to engage the creature with a more substantial strike to the head of the creature with the crowbar. This infuriated the creature, and the vile, cruel beast unfurled its proboscis and drove it into Rick's forehead just above his right eye, and then injected its digestive enzymes directly into his brain cavity, He convulsed, and the grand mal seizures became so intense that several vertebrae snapped, and while the seizures started to subdue due to the digestion process, the creature began puncturing his bones and feeding upon his bone marrow, while he was still conscious enough to feel the pain before the digestion process was completed in his brain cavity. As the creature was feeding, it heard the cargo elevator door open. It snapped its head up and was struck by one of Mike Patterson's rounds from his .38 special revolver. As Mike advanced and fired 3 more shots, the creature flopped around on the floor and jumped in between one of the shelves of the large shelving units lined up in the storage bay. Mike continued to advance, and he was looking intently to his right through the shelves to try and locate whatever it was that he had just shot and hit. Mike suddenly found himself shut up against one of the concrete columns, and with a hand pushing the right side of his face up against the column and a massive right hand on the left side of his head. The force of the movement caused him to drop his pistol, and he was able to look to his extreme left and see the snapping mandibles of his attacker. The creature put his left hand to Mike's face and emitted the paralyzing toxic mist, and Mike was laying on the floor and being fed upon within seconds. Tony Mills was on his rounds outside the semi-trailer parking area when he heard what he thought was a gunshot, and as he looked up, he could see Mike's muzzle flashes lighting up the windows of the 4th floor. He ran to the nearest extension phone, and the switchboard operator Elaine could not get the security office to answer. Tony told Elaine to call the city police and get a couple of squad cars here as quick as possible, and to lock herself in the office. He bolted for the nearest elevator and proceeded to ascend the floors. He heard glass breaking and wished that the elevators were faster. He opened the elevator door and with his pistol drawn was met with an eerie silence as he called out for Mike or Larry. Larry Holmes was the other security guard on that shift, but was never found again on the property or anywhere for that matter. Tony observed boxes, parts and crates strewn all over the floor, and a pool of blood near the platform truck, and 2 long piles of very fine dust that were being blown around in the breeze of the open window and the 2 smashed windows. He found Mike's revolver, and it had only 1 round left. He put his right hand on one of the columns and shook his head in shock, and exclaimed, "What the hell happened here?" The city police arrived and kept asking questions that Tony and the others could not answer. Then the Oklahoma Highway Patrol came onto the scene and asked the same questions. And later that morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation showed up and took all the remaining members of the night shift to the Bureau's office and ordered the Highway Patrol to seal the building. And then later that night, several people in plain civilian clothes showed up from Fort Worth, Texas. All had military haircuts, and they went in, and after about 10 minutes, one of them came out and got on the radio. And within 2 hours, the place was crawling with military and civilian government personnel. The strange thing is they didn't want any local investigators in the facility, and when they were allowed in, everything had been cleaned from top to bottom. The rumor was that it was the cleanest warehouse in the city, or the state for that matter, and the local newspapers went silent on any of the reporting that they had begun, and any other media outlets that had run any articles about the incident, namely the Tulsa World, who had run 2 articles about it, and they were removed from the archive of the paper. And to date, none of them have resurfaced anywhere. The families of the men were told that the bodies were contaminated with a deadly chemical from the warehouse, and they were cremated for safety. The time is now 9:12 a.m. Central Standard Time, September 23rd. 1947. In a memo sent to the White House and the newly founded Department of Defense, Lieutenant General Twining of the Air Material Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, stated after careful study as to the physical accuracy of the phenomenon, "I have concluded that the phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious. They are resolute. The objects are as large as a man-made aircraft and are metallic in appearance. It is of my opinion that the articles within our possession at this time are non-terrestrial origin and are of extremely high military and national security value." This document in the hands of President Truman was the genesis of the Majestic 12 Committee or otherwise known as MJ12. The executive order created the ultra-high security group, the subsequent subgroups, and committees on November 25, 2002. The Department of Homeland Security was founded, and then on December 1, 2002, George W. Bush, by executive order, removed any crosswalk authority from the newly formed agency, thus insulting the MJ12 group from any other access or authority. This was something overlooked by Congress. Whether was intentional or unintentional, we may never know, and was subsequently blocked by any oversight committee intrusions, even blocked the so-called black budget items. No president since that date has dared to revoke this executive order. On December 8, 2002, the Majestic 12 group will be reorganized into the Blue Horizon Contingency Initiative, headquartered at the Dugway Providing Grounds Blue Technology Campus, with working groups and fabrication facilities spread across the country. Thule Air Force Base in Greenland and parts of the Alaskan Arctic. The Blue Biotechnology Group operates out of the Groom Lake facility, known as the Diversity Arc-Light Project. The Blue Horizon Contingency Initiative, so far to date, is responsible for $7.9 trillion of our national debt. At least that's what's on the books. In a 1988 interview, Senator Barry Goldwater stated he had asked General Curtis LeMay for access to the secret UFO rooms at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the angry LeMay said, "Not only can't you get into it, but you don't ever mention it to me again." Even the lies leach truth from time to time. The time is now 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, September 29th, 2010. The cool of the early fall day mixed with the last rays of the heat from the sun on the next to the last day of September, and the full hunting season for deer was just 4 days old. The woman archery hunter headed for her deer stand and was in hopes of harvesting one in the woods of her home in Manchester, Ohio, just north of the Ohio River. And for the telling of this encounter, we will call her Jean. Now, Jean's tree stand was about 15 feet off the ground, and the tree canopy extended at least 45 feet above her. The forest was alive with the sounds of movements from the squirrels, birds, and crickets. She had been sitting in a tree stand, texting on her phone and watching her hunting lanes. At about 6:21 p.m., she decided to photograph herself in the tree stand. She was facing east with the sun behind her, and as she held the camera above and to her left, the sun was behind her, and was low in the west. While the sunlight was filtering through the leaves and branches of the trees, she took the first photo, and then a second. As she viewed the second photo, she didn't like it, and so she deleted it. Then the forest fell silent. The overwhelming force of this caused her to text her friend and convey the feelings that she was experiencing. This is the actual text message sent by Jean to her friend from the tree stand. "Something is wrong. The woods just went to a dead silence. No squirrels, no birds, no crickets. Oh, it's odd." 6:23 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Now, she had seen this happen when some predator animal caused the quiet, as she knows, being a hunter. When a predator such as a bear, for example, enters an area, the other animals tend to become quiet. And then she became aware that a weird visual effect was moving rightward across her field of view at an apparent distance of maybe 15 to 20 feet. It visually looked like a heat mirage above a hot road or looking through plastic wrap. A more conventional description would be a cloaking effect like that of the movie Predator. The visual was about 25 feet above the ground in a canopy of the trees and about 10 feet higher than her tree stand. She took her glasses off and rubbed her right eye, thinking at first that she had a floater, a mote in the eye. But after rubbing it, it was still there, and it was not a floater. It moved to her right about 15 degrees, and then straight ahead about 45 degrees to the right, and then it disappeared. And things looked normal, and she could hear the normal sounds again. Jean recalled that she had held the camera in her right hand, about 1.5 feet from her face, and this would allow her eyes to focus while using a viewing screen. She pointed the camera in the direction of the distortion and took a picture. She snapped the picture as the distortion disappeared. And Jean sat in the tree stand for another 1.5 hours, and then about 7:45 she came down from her stand and went home to have dinner with some guests for the evening She did not mention the strange experience to her guests. After the evening concluded, Jean checked her Facebook messages and opened one from her nephew, who was still in high school, and he was relating his story of how several students witnessed a bright light over the band practice field just before dark. The high school is about a mile north-northwest of Jean's tree stand, and he wrote, "We were playing tonight in a field, and just as it was starting to get dark, a huge bright light appeared over the field and began to move sideways, and then, in a matter of 5 seconds or so, it disappeared, getting smaller almost every second. About 5 minutes later, it reappeared. This time it was amber in color. I know of 4 people who saw this, and according to an upperclassman, the same thing happened last year, and they actually stopped rehearsal." Now Jean asked him about what time did this happen, and he responded, 7:50 to 8 p.m. or about an hour and a half after Jean's phenomenon encounter. This is the actual encounter as was described in David Polodi's movie Missing 411, The Haunted. It is my contention that Jean encountered one of the Flomaragian, an adolescent, and that is why she is still here. Or she encountered one on the run from the Vartus who was still attempting to exterminate or recapture specimens, and or the offspring from the Roswell crash of 1947. Time is now, the present. We must still ourselves for the eventual disclosure, not just of the Roswell incident, but the UFO, USO, EBE, etc., etc., and all the relative doublespeak coming from the government about this subject. The latest flow of ball is the current disclosure of the Navy videos of the gun camera footage from the unknowns harassing the carrier battle group. Think about this. A military spokesman stated that we have found no evidence that these objects are of extraterrestrial origins. And in the same breath, but we don't know what they are. What? How can you determine that these are not of alien origin if you don't know what they are? And so, here is my supposition. The aliens either brought these cloaked beings to Earth intentionally or unintentionally, and they are on the loose on our planet and are at least in part responsible for the missing 411 cases. Voltaire wrote, "If there's life on other planets, then the Earth is the universe insane asylum. And maybe that is what we are, a refuse pile of good ideas gone bad, but that shouldn't keep us from being a good vacation spot. Welcome to Humanity Park." However, maybe it is like H.G. Wells said in his book War of the Worlds. As men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in the drop of water. They do keep tabs on us, just to make sure we do not become too virulent. After all, a pandemic of humanity spreading across the oceans of space might be too much for even those super minds guarding the asylum. So, lock your doors and your windows, as if that's going to keep them out tonight. I'm pretty sure we're going to need a better plan, especially since there is one standing outside your window. Imagination is everything. It is the preview of life's coming attractions. Albert Einstein. Wow. Wow. Suddenly another one. Wow. Absolutely worth the wait, and an intriguing and thought-provoking piece of writing there from the incredible mind of our good friend Edward Ed Smith, exclusive to the DMT Forest Affair channel. A humongous thank you, Ed, for your patience on this one, and of course, incredible writing. Got to be one of the most interesting UFO alien subjects ever discussed. I suspect within the next 10 years, we will have full disclosure. But of course, I hope you enjoyed this rendition. I hope I brought some flair and personal touch to each and every voice. I look forward to more of your adventures in the future. Well, guys and girls, as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. Now, if you're an aspiring writer or would just like to get in touch with me, please do so at the contact email, which is as on screen. contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope you all had a fantastic weekend with friends or family, with good food and even better company, and enjoying the beautiful sunshine. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry. The Gunnison National Forest was established on June 3rd. The time is now. The time now is 2:14 p.m. Mountain Standard. The phase and instability of the neutron injectors will allow an unmonitored amount of Alirium to be mixed with radio. Fuck's sake! And there was more debris located around the craft that looked like the first crash site. Fucking dickhead. The phase and instabilities of the neutron injectors were allowed in on... You also discover what it looked like... On page 43 of 61. And as ever, please do let us know down. And as ever, please do let us know. And as ever, please do let us know down. It's gonna be a good day, isn't it? And as ever, please do let us know down. What the fuck is wrong with my mouth?